Indian futures for putting together. You can leave me out of the equation, but for other speakers, I can say you've got some of the best people really who have competence and domain expertise. So that would be that's a fantastic job, well done. And I realize from the conversation you had, many of the people are outside Delhi, and sometimes one tends to forget that. So thank you very much and congratulations. I will jump straight into the subject because we have 45 minutes during which I will speak so that we have enough time for questions. Is that okay, Manishji? I can go ahead on that. Yeah, thank you. So let me begin by saying, perhaps stating the obvious. India is a sui generis country, and sui generis in Latin really means a very unique and a special country. All of you know that India is special, but what I have in mind when I speak of India's trade and economic diplomacy is that, to my mind, India is the only country today in the WTO or in the world which is developed, developing, and least developed rolled into one. So this is the biggest problem that we have when we negotiate outside. Who do you negotiate for? You have a very small number of people who probably live like developed countries. Very small number. It's not a big number. For the large majority of the middle class and the lower middle class, it's probably a developing country. But I always believe that you should take a look at villages in India. And since I have done a lot of postings in Africa, I'm a very much a patriotic person, so don't get me wrong. I do honestly believe there is nothing to choose between the least developed parts of India and sub-Saharan Africa, which I'm very familiar with. So a proud Indian doesn't mean that you fail to recognize the realities in your country. Large parts of the country resemble least developed countries of the world. And if you compare West Bengal and Bangladesh, and Bengalis in the audience will please forgive me, I'm a huge fan of Didi, but that is beside the point. Fact is, Bangladesh does better than West Bengal on some of the human indicators. So it's best to start with this proposition that we are a very special country, not just because of the size, not just because we are the world's largest democracy, but because negotiating India's economic diplomacy becomes very difficult when you have a country which shows characteristics of developing, least developed, and a little bit of developed country. So this makes the job of a negotiator very, very difficult. I wanted to make this point so that all of you are aware of it. I will want to focus on 4 philosophical underpinnings of our economic diplomacy. Every diplomatic approach that a country decides is based on some philosophy. You must have some, I'm not talking objectives. We will come to objectives later, but I'm talking about a philosophical outlook as to what is it that it is based on. So the first philosophical underpinning of India's economic and trade diplomacy, to my mind, is what I have chosen to call, in my own words, Gandhi litmus test. It's called the Mahatma Gandhi litmus test. So what is this litmus test? You know, if you have read Gandhi's writings, he always asks policymakers and rulers, please think of the poorest person you have met in your life. And if you can do something to wipe away his tears, then you have done a good job. So I have used it and somewhat tweaked it and modified it by saying Gandhi litmus test. So what is this Gandhi litmus test? When I negotiated the WTO, what is this Gandhi litmus test? The Gandhi litmus test is, if you take a given point in time, and we will take today's India, my assessment is we've got at least 300 million people who live in absolute poverty. It may be more, but we will assume that it is at least 300 million people. So my reason when I negotiate, I may not be able to make the fate of these lives better, but at least I have an obligation to ensure that their lot doesn't become worse after I negotiate. So if I go to a free trade agreement, and we will talk of free trade agreements later on, it should not be that it benefits Manish ji, it benefits Mohan, Kumar, it benefits you in the audience, but it puts these 300 million people in greater misery. They are bad as it is. But you cannot, it is not acceptable if you have a conscience. It is not acceptable also if you are in a democracy. You can't allow that to happen. No government in India can tolerate that. So I begin with this Gandhi litmus test. If possible, every trade negotiation must lead to better lives of these 300 million people. But if not, at least you have an obligation to ensure that their fate does not become worse. So that is the Gandhi litmus test. In terms of concrete examples, I take you back to the Uruguay round when we negotiated intellectual property rights, the TRIPS agreement. Why is it that we were opposed to TRIPS? Because we thought the cost of anacin or paracetamol might suddenly become 100 rupees. Now, you and I might say, what is 100 rupees? But for the poor person, this is the cheapest country in the world for drugs. So if you accept the intellectual property rights that the Americans wanted or the Europeans wanted, then all drug prices in India would have shot up. So I give this as an example as to why we opposed intellectual property rights, because there are American friends of mine who say that Indians are very intelligent people. Why do you oppose intellectual property rights? Indians should be the smartest guys in the world. They come to Bay Area, they work in IT. So the reason is this Gandhi litmus test. And that will continue. For example, one of the reasons we did not join the RCEP is because the milkmen, the farmers who are selling milk, will have had to face competition from Australia and New Zealand dairy farmers. So we said no. It's one of the reasons, not the main reason. But I'm giving you again the philosophical reason why India is not able to accept everything. Sometimes India is seen as a naysayer in international trade negotiations. The reason is this Gandhi litmus test. The second philosophical underpinning when government of India goes and negotiates economic and trade diplomacy is policy space. So what is this policy space? The policy space is the maneuverability and flexibility that a government wants for itself. So I'll give you an example. If you take the import of electronic products in India, there is a difference between the applied tariff and the bound tariff. I don't want to make this into a masterclass of WTO, but you must know the difference between applied tariff and bound tariff. The bound tariff is an undertaking and a commitment given by India to the WTO that we will not increase duties beyond 20% on, let us say, television, Sony television, which comes into India. This is the bound rate. The applied rate, however, may be only 10%. So there is a difference between bound rate in the WTO and the applied rate. This difference of 10% and 20% is called tariff slack. And the reason is Government of India wants policy space so that it can increase the customs duties on electronic products if it either wants to protect domestic industry or in a particular year, it may fall short of revenues. So if you have to increase customs duties on products, you need policy space. So that is the second philosophical underpinning for trade negotiations. The third, obviously, we are a democracy. We are like any other country. Domestic interest groups play a very important role in India's trade and economic diplomacy. So if you take steel, one of the issues in RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, was Chinese steel is at least 30% less than Indian steel. Indian steel is good, we are productive, but we are not as competitive as Chinese steel. So if you allow Chinese steel to come into India at 0% duty, it'll wipe out the Indian steel manufacturers. They've got steel production in excess, as you know, China. So The third important aspect of India's trade and economic diplomacy is that you have to take into account domestic interest groups or domestic companies, domestic manufacturers, and you need to provide them some protection. It is possible to argue that sometimes we are held hostage by domestic industry in India. That is my personal view as well. But I am trying to explain here the various factors which play a role in India's economic diplomacy. The last philosophical underpinning, as I call it, is geopolitical imperatives. So you tell me 10 years ago, India signed an FTA with Singapore, of all countries. Now, Singapore is really like Kanpur. If you want me to give you an example, Singapore is the size of Kanpur. Why the hell should India go and sign an FTA with Singapore? The reason was Prime Minister Manmohan Singh said in Parliament that Singapore, there is a lot of investment which is routed through Singapore. There were geopolitical reasons. We thought we should indicate through the FTA that India is open for investment and open for business. So the reasons are not entirely economic, they are geopolitical. So you need to understand that as well. So these are the four broad factors, if you like, which guide India's economic diplomacy. And I'll be happy to take questions later on. Let us now come to the overarching objectives of India's economic and trade diplomacy. We need to be clear about the objectives. So the first objective to my mind is we need to keep overseas markets for Indian goods and services open. India needs to import goods and services. It will surprise some of you to know that if you take India's GDP, 40 to 50% of India's GDP is foreign trade. It is exports and imports. By the way, not all imports are bad. We should not use the Trumpian logic that only exports are good and imports are all bad. That's not true. But it depends on what you import. But the fact of the matter is, India cannot pursue its economic diplomacy if we don't have overseas markets which are open for our goods and services. Increasingly, India is becoming also an important services exporter. So not just goods, but also services. And this is extremely important. One of the objectives of India's economic diplomacy, therefore, is to resist protectionism in Western markets and in Eastern markets. One of the things that we have tried to negotiate with the Chinese is that our pharmaceutical products must get more access in Chinese markets. That is the same case with ASEAN as well. So I'm just trying to explain one important objective is to keep overseas markets open and free for our goods and services. The second important aspect of India's economic and trade diplomacy is to attract substantial FDI, foreign direct investment. India needs foreign direct investment. We are one of the largest recipients of foreign direct investment in the world. It's about 60 to 70 billion dollars. But I would say the following: we are a capital deficient country. We need FDI. The question is the old debate. Do you need FDI in potato chips or do you need FDI in computer chips? So this is the debate between potato chips and computer chips. Now, I have a lot of young people, I presume, in the audience, and you'll be shocked at what I'm going to tell you. Why do you need 20 varieties of toothbrush? Tell me. Why do you need 20 varieties of chips? You guys have got used to it. But those of us, I'm 63 years old, when I grew up, this is the wrong kind of investment. Where you need foreign direct investment in India is in the sectors of infrastructure, energy, manufacturing, capital equipment. That is where you need FDI. We have liberalized across the board. So what you need when you go to the supermarket is, you'll find chips from Australia, you'll find chips from America. Those of us who we grew up with Nathu's chips, and there is nothing wrong with it, let me tell you. So I am quite a reactionary, if you like, but that is why FDI needs to be channeled. I do not believe for a moment that India can have a completely free FDI regime across the board. We have to have intervention in such a way that you develop self-reliance, and that is what the Prime Minister has been talking about. And one of the things we have done is you would have noticed from the press that recently the FDI policy was tweaked to kind of screen strategically the Chinese investments which are coming to India. There is nothing wrong with that. Because if you see the investment that's coming, Zomato, your, what is it, your Swiggy, your Paytm, now these may create jobs. They may call you delivery executives while you're going and delivering food to people. That is fine. But this is not the kind of investment that will make India more competitive. So that was what the government's perspective was. So FDI needs to be discretionary. FDI needs to be channeled into the right sectors. The next important objective of India's economic and trade diplomacy is access to technology. Without technology, I do not see how India can be a leading power in 21st century. One end of the spectrum is 5G. You've all heard of 5G. You've heard of the controversy surrounding Huawei, the Chinese company, and 5G. What is India going to do about 5G? Because 5G appears to be the future. On the other hand, even a small and medium enterprise exporting leather goods needs access to the latest technology. Now, China has done a wonderful job of making sure that all FDI which comes into their country is contingent on transfer of technology. We have not been so successful. So this is a challenge for India. We need to have access to the latest technology so that our small and medium enterprises can become more productive, can become big exporters, and they can become really, and for this you need cutting edge technology. You take the future economic landscape. What are you going to do about electric vehicles? Does India have the latest technology for electric vehicles? You take solar energy. 90% of solar panels today in India are imported. I frankly tell you, this is unacceptable because solar panels is not rocket science. India can do it. And we need to do it. We cannot be dependent on one country, China or any other country, for import of 90% of solar panels in India. So technology is important. And if you cannot develop it, you need to have access to the latest technology. One way or the other, you have to have the latest technology in order to be competitive. The other objective, which applies to a lot of young people, I also teach at Jindal, and a lot of students ask me the same question. India needs a liberal immigration regime. That is, other countries need to have a liberal immigration regime. We are currently experiencing a youth bulge in India. Now, it is good to talk of a demographic dividend. I completely share the view that it is good that India doesn't face the problem of China. China, there is a problem because of the one-child policy. Their population is declining too soon. In India, we don't have that problem. But having said that, we should not be naive. We still need our young people to emigrate. So when I was India's ambassador in Bahrain, I realized why there are 8 million Indians who work in 6 Gulf countries. And you sometimes feel bad. There are postgraduates who are cleaning toilets in the Gulf. Let's be honest about it. So we are at a situation where we are not able to provide meaningful economic opportunities to all our people. For the foreseeable future, we need immigration regimes or immigration regimes of other countries to be liberal. So why do you think India takes up with the United States the question of H-1B? We need H-1B visas because we have to encourage a lot of Indians to go abroad. Right now, it is in our interest to do that. Hopefully, many of you will come back when the conditions are right in the country. But for now, it is important that we provide an immigration safety valve for our youth. So that is an important aspect of India's economic diplomacy. The last general point, when India approaches economic diplomacy and what its objectives are, our expectation is that hitherto we have been a rule taker. That is, we accept the rules made by others and which are given to India. We accept it. We would like to become a rule shaper. So India has to make this transition from being a rule taker to a rule shaper. How does India do that? Well, one way to do that is you need to take the initiative to refashion domestic reforms. You need to take an initiative to look at regional fora, to look at WTO. Can you do something to reform the WTO? That is one of the ways in which you can become a rule shaper instead of a rule taker. And as you become bigger economically, I suspect India will also get a bigger role from other countries, and we should be prepared to make that transition from being just a rule taker to a rule shaper. One other thing I would emphasize, I said we are a capital deficient country. In the context of COVID-19, World Bank has given us $1 billion. WHO, the World Health Organization, one of the biggest programs it runs is in India with regard to smallpox, with regard to tuberculosis and so on. I want to make this point, no matter how proud you are as an Indian and how much you talk of self-reliance and so on, we need help on these fronts. So we cannot refuse World Bank help, Asian Development Bank. The Asian Infrastructure Bank, which is funded almost completely by China, guess who takes the biggest loans from Asia Infrastructure Bank? It's India. 80% of the loans of Asia Infrastructure Bank is India. So India needs a lot of loans from a lot of multilateral lenders. This also figures in India's economic and trade diplomacy. Okay. There is a vital link between India becoming an economic powerhouse and the rest of the sessions that you have been hearing, organized by Manish Ji. You've been hearing, China. You've been hearing United States. You've been hearing Pakistan. May I put it to you, out of modesty, that without being an economic powerhouse, without having resources, you can say goodbye to your American policy, Pakistan policy, and China policy. You cannot. The only reason why you are able to carry out a successful diplomacy or foreign policy today is thanks to the reforms that you made in 91, which opened up the economy, which created a huge middle class, and which made India lift people out of poverty. So for me, students ask me, what is the most important objective of India's foreign policy? I always tell them, forget about territorial integrity. I mean, this is going to be somewhat scandalous when I say it, but Manish Ji will forgive me. Forget Kashmir, forget territorial integrity, forget Doklam, forget Ladakh, forget everything. If you become a $10 trillion economy, the whole world will come to you. They will come to you and you can solve all these problems. You continue to be a poor country at 2.7 trillion. When your adversary is $14 trillion GDP, you can do whatever you want, you will not be successful. Now, what I'm saying is obviously somewhat controversial because Kashmir is important, territorial integrity is important, etc. But for me, the most important objective of India's foreign policy today is economic. I say that unabashedly because if you cannot lift the 300, 400 million people out of poverty, then how are other countries going to take you seriously? You will continue to be a poor country. You will continue to be dragged down by these 300, 400 million people, and it is not their fault. It's the country's fault. So I would say for the next 5 years, our real objective in India's foreign policy should be, by hook or crook, you have to make sure that we abolish not poverty, because abolishing poverty in India is almost an impossible task in my lifetime. I'm 63, so in my lifetime, I'm not sure. But abolishing extreme poverty, defined by World Bank as $1.9 per head per month. At least that you should get rid of. If you closely watch the two meetings in China, you know, you've heard of the two meetings, the National Consultative People's Congress, what they had recently. One of the goals was in 2020, they were supposed to abolish poverty in China. Unfortunately, the COVID has intervened and they have not been able to do it. Take the number of people who are living in poverty in China and India. China has maximum of 10 million people today living in poverty. Maximum. We have 300 to 400 million people. This is completely unacceptable. I'm not saying we should equal China in every respect. They have a different political system. They're a different country. But our overriding goal in Indian foreign policy has to be getting rid of this kind of persistent poverty. Only then can you achieve your geopolitical ambitions. So economic diplomacy cannot be seen in isolation. It is very closely interlinked to foreign policy. How can you see, we were able to support Afghanistan with $5 billion, and we were able to build the Salma Dam. The kind of assistance we have given to Afghanistan, we were able to do only because of our economic reforms and because we had money. I need $5 billion. I used to joke to my foreign secretary when I was joint secretary, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives. I said, give me $5 billion for each of India's neighbors. I will implement Monroe Doctrine. No other power will ever come to India's neighborhood. You need money. Today, there is no point crying that China is investing in a power plant in Bangladesh. Arey kya ho gaya? Why can't we do it? Well, the Bangladeshis, the Nepalese, the Sri Lankans, they will all come to you and say, sir, if you don't invest, we will go to Pakistan, we will go to China. But that is normal. They will come and tell you. Sometimes they will even bluff when they do that. But the fact of the matter is, you have to have economic resources in order to carry out a successful foreign policy. I now turn to my last part. Manish, if you allow me, a last part of my speech, and then we can take questions. What are the global trends in international trade and how India approaches it? So the first observation I have in terms of global trends in international trade is that international trade is moving away from WTO anchored MFN based trade. MFN is over. India was able to successfully make use of the most favored nation rule, and we were able to export a lot of goods and services to other countries. But the international trading system has become extremely fragmented. You are going to have an RCEP zone. You're going to have a TPP zone. You're going to have a United States, Mexico, Canada zone, and you're going to have a European zone. So it is important that India makes up its mind as to which is the zone it wants to target. How does India decide this? India will have to decide it, keeping in mind where is it that India's goods and services can be exported in the next 10 years, the best prospects for India exporting. I ask you the question, do you really think China can be a huge market for India's exports? I strongly doubt it. If there is any evidence so far, it is that China is so competitive in most of the products, it'll be very difficult for us to export anything. So we need to look and make this strategic decision. If the international trading system is fragmented, where does India fit in? The second observation I have on international trade, trade is going to be reciprocal, preferential, and strategic. Let me explain all three, okay? I will begin by saying trade is reciprocal. So if you're looking at India, America, forget about China, US, that's a big trade war. But even looking at India and the US is saying, why should we allow Mahindra vehicles to come to United States at 0% duty, when we can't export American cars and American Harley Davidson motorcycles at 0% duty. They're not bothered about whether India is a developing country, India is a poor country. No. So this is a trend that India has to be ready for. Your access that you give is that it is going to be considered as reciprocity. You give me something, I get you something. So it is not MFN again. That's what I'm trying to say. So trade is going to be reciprocal. So India is negotiating a bilateral trade deal with the United States. What we are trying to do is, can we allow Californian almonds to come to India, and then India can export buffalo meat to America? So it's reciprocity. Similarly, can India get something on H-1B visas? Instead of that, we can maybe allow American exports. Americans would like to export Boeing airplanes, which India buys in large numbers. So trade is going to be reciprocal. The second observation I have, trade is also going to be preferential. Let me explain. If you take garment exports from India, India exports garments, so do Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. You should wonder as an Indian why Bangladeshi exports and Vietnamese exports and Sri Lankan exports are seen abroad. You don't see very many Indian exports. You only see Indian bed sheets and pillow covers and all that. If you walk into a Gap store or a Marks and Spencer store, you will not see very many shirts and pants from India. Why is that? The reason is Sri Lanka and Bangladesh have got 0% duty on exports to European Union. India, while it is a beneficiary of GSP, still has to pay 8% customs duty on exports. This 8% puts India at a disadvantage compared to Bangladesh. Bangladesh also claims it's a least developed country. So all least developed countries to Europe have an advantage of 0% duty. Do I have 5 minutes, Manish? Okay. So Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka enjoy preferential trade. India does not. So I'm saying the future is going to be preferential. If that is the case, India needs to sign FTAs, free trade agreements. We are not party to the RCEP. We, however, have FTAs with ASEAN, Malaysia. Sorry, we have FTAs with ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. Ironically, we do not have a single FTA to the west of India. All our FTAs are to the east of India. I think it's time India looked at west, that is Europe. We came very close to signing an FTA with European Union. Unfortunately, we couldn't. United States, we need to look at it because your biggest export markets are EU and United States. And I'm saying trade is going to be preferential. So we have no choice but to sign an FTA. Lastly, I would say trade is also going to become extremely strategic. COVID has demonstrated that even though it's only a question of face mask or paracetamol or hydrochlorine tablets, these are strategic. When you have a pandemic, some products and services become strategic in character. And a lot of trade is going to be strategic. For example, semiconductors. Semiconductors are manufactured in Taiwan and in United States. Samsung and others need semiconductors. So semiconductor trade is going to become extremely strategic. Similarly, lithium, cobalt, these are essential for the future, whether it is 4G, robotics, automation, automated industry, and so on. So artificial intelligence and so on. So some products and trade in products and services is going to become very, very strategic. As they say, trade is too important a matter to be left to trade diplomats. Trade is going to become extremely strategic. Lastly, I want to say that global value chains and supply chains will undergo a change post-COVID. How much change? Can India get a share of the pie? And how soon this will happen, I don't know. But it seems to me that COVID has demonstrated to people that just in time manufacturing, there is a thing called just in time manufacturing. That is, there is no inventory at all. When you have globalization and when you have manufacturing, there is no inventory. So this will, I think, fundamentally change. One last word, I'll take 1 minute, Manish, please, if with your permission. Uh,
So we have more than 5 minutes, so it's fine if you can just, yeah.
Excellent. I will take 5 minutes then. Now, I have explained, let me recapitulate. I've explained to you the philosophical underpinning of India's economic diplomacy. I've explained to you the key objectives of economic diplomacy. I've explained the necessity of India becoming a $10 trillion economy or a $5 trillion economy as quickly as possible. I made the point that without these, all your talk of Pakistan, China, United States is pie in the sky. You can talk as much as you want. If you don't have the resources, you're not going to be able to carry out successful diplomacy. That is, it's important to see that intrinsic link. I finally pointed out some trends in international trade. I made the point that trade is going to be preferential, reciprocal, and strategic. Let me finally, in the next 3-4 minutes, address key reforms that India has to carry out. If all this economic diplomacy, foreign direct investment has to be successful, India must also offer an attractive economic environment domestically. Otherwise, no foreign investor is going to come. So, one of the things that we have talked about, and I'm glad the government used the COVID to announce reforms in land, labor, and laws. They called it the 3 L's. And this is absolutely necessary. We have talked for the last 20 years about land reforms. One of the reasons why Indian investors are going to Bangladesh for garments is this, that it has become so difficult to acquire land in India. And we have got a labor law in India, which is almost 19th century. This is also put off. When I asked Indian textile manufacturers, why are you going to Bangladesh? Why are you going to Sri Lanka instead of focusing on India? They say that it is far easier to do business there. And they cite land and labor. So land, labor, it's a very good thing that some state governments have already made decisions, but other governments, I think, are following suit. Unfortunately, land labor is either a state subject or a concurrent list subject. That's the problem we have in India. We have a federal structure which is so complicated that it becomes difficult. But I think these reforms are absolutely necessary. Otherwise, it's impossible to dream of a $10 trillion economy. The other thing I would also say in terms of reforms is the transaction costs for commercial operators in India. The transaction cost is very, very high. To try to comply with Indian laws is not easy. There is one environment, there is one electricity, there is one safety. We just have got things, considerable progress has been made by the current government. I must give full marks to the current government. We have made a lot of progress, but yet more work remains to be done. We have to reduce the transaction costs. Take a simple thing like your trucks from Noida to Delhi. The trucks can only travel in night. Now, this essentially means in today's world, already 12 hours is gone. You have to wait for 10 o'clock in the night and then you allow the trucks to come in. So we have to find a way by which goods move quickly from point A to point B. But I'm just giving an example, but there are other examples of transaction costs. Finally, and I'd like to conclude my intervention or speech at this point, we need regulation in the area of e-commerce. Extremely important. E-commerce is going to be the future, whether we like it or not. All of you are familiar, and probably many of you have stopped going to malls even before COVID. Now, of course, you guys won't go, You're already ordering everything through Amazon, etc., etc. I want to underline the importance of this statement. Data is the new oil. I hope you've heard this statement. So please look at it carefully. We have different worlds of data in the world. Take the United States. There, the data is owned by companies which are described as GAFA, G-A-F-A, which is Google, Alphabet, Facebook, Apple. I'm giving an example. The French call it GAFA, but you can call it whatever you want. The main big companies, they own data in the United States. They monetize this data. You take China, it has got a completely different model. China model is they don't allow Google, they don't allow Amazon, they don't allow Twitter, but they've got their own Alibaba, Tencent, and other companies. So the Chinese market is a completely different model. You take the two other models or other three. The other three big worlds for data is India, Europe, and Africa, broadly speaking. So India, in a way, is the worst example. We have absolutely no regulatory mechanism today. Anybody is free to come and use Indian data. You see, why is it that India is concerned even about Chinese or any other investment? If you can get data from Paytm, Swiggy, and Zomato, I know what you guys are ordering. I know what you guys are eating. I know what you guys are watching, Netflix, Amazon, and I know what you guys are doing in terms of habits, your browsing habits. If I know this, then I own India's data. And India's data is not a simple data. We are talking about at least 300 to 400 million customers. So if I know these habits, I can then do an algorithm and I can monetize the data. So in India right now, it's a very unregulated field. And I don't think we can continue like this forever. In the case of data, and I will finish here, the important questions are threefold. One, who owns data? Very important. Ownership of data. Second, who monetizes data? In other words, who converts it into money? And lastly, data privacy. That is, if I know what you guys are eating, watching, etc., can I monetize it without your permission? Can I do it? Am I allowed to do it? For example, if I have data about who has tested positive and who has tested negative in COVID, extremely useful information for tomorrow, not for today, for tomorrow, to know the kind of drugs, to know the kind of body type and comorbidity. These are extremely important data. So data is going to be the new oil, but the key questions which India has not resolved: who owns data, who monetizes data, and how to ensure privacy of individuals. This is the most important. I will conclude by pointing out the contrarian nature of Indians. It's really funny. You know, an Indian will have no problem, an average Indian will have no problem going to the American embassy or the French embassy and giving his whole life story. No problem. For getting a visa, I'm happy to give you my bank account. I'm happy to give you my horoscope. I'm happy to give you, my entire life history. But you tell them Arogya Setu, they have a big problem. Are, kya hai? Why should I give information to the government? I think we have to get rid of this double standards, frankly. You have no problem giving as you speak, your data is being used by GAFA. It's being used by other companies. You don't seem to have a problem with it. I mean, I said Paytm, Zomato, Swiggy are all Chinese owned, or at least Chinese controlled. And they have the data today, not Indian companies or not government. So we have to get a perspective on what is the data, how this data is going to be used. Because if data is the new oil, India needs a data protection authority. And that is something that we have to swiftly decide in the course of the next 1 year or so. So, Manish ji, once again, thank you for this opportunity. I hope I've raised some questions, and I'll be quite happy to answer the questions from your audience. Thank you very much.
Thank